Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just did a little bit of a recruiting update, tons of commitments coming in over the last couple of days, and I think they're going to continue coming in, and some of the bigger ones might be coming in over the next week or so, so definitely we'll keep you updated on that as you need to know it, but let's jump into the last segment here. Let's get into Wednesday what-ifs, and let's do a little bit of a realignment edition here. There are a ton of things that need to be broken down as we get into this new world of realignment. Everything became official about 2 days ago, and a lot of stuff has happened since then on the Twitter world, but let's talk about what's going to happen on the gridiron this upcoming year. And I think there's a lot of interesting questions. And the biggest one to me is what happens if three of the major conferences are won by new members? Because this is something that just could happen, to be totally honest with you. Utah is number one in odds to win the Big 12. Texas and Oregon are number two in the SEC and the Big 10, respectively, to win both those conferences. And all of those teams have very good shots, honestly, to make that happen. Now, obviously, there's a ton of hurdles for them to get over to get to that point, but when you look at it from a preseason perspective, it's not the craziest thought in the world. And also, you have teams like Oklahoma, you have teams like USC or Arizona that absolutely could help this out a little bit and maybe have some big time years and make their way into that conversation. So it's not just Utah, Texas, and Oregon, but frankly, I think at least two of the three would have to come out of this group if this were going to come true. You know, you could see an Arizona pop up, you could see a USC or an Oklahoma pop up, although those are a little bit less likely. But at the end of the day, you could see that happen, but two of the three are likely going to have to come out of those, and I think Texas and Oregon are really the two that may be the most important here. Obviously, I think Oklahoma has the capability to pull it off, but they're riding a little bit of a tightrope. Let's just be honest, this first year, but going forward, I think they'll be more than fine. It is relatively unlikely in the ACC. You know, watch out for SMU because they're a team that could be dangerous and maybe could help this out a ton and win that conference, but obviously they're not necessarily towards the top of the list. There's obviously questions around all of these teams. You know, how do Texas and OU adapt to the new physicality that they're going to deal with in the SEC? You know, does Utah kind of handle the Big 12 the way that everyone kind of expects them to, which is walk in and just roll over everyone, to be totally honest with you? Does that happen, or do they have a little bit of an adjustment period as they get used to the new styles and all of the differences from the Pac-12 to the Big 12? And then you obviously have Oregon and USC walking into the Big 10, which is kind of the same problem that Texas and OU have, where it is going to be more physical pretty much across the board, and you're just going to have to get more used to that. There's going to be games where you're leaving a Minnesota game and you think that you would feel totally fine. You won't. I can almost promise you that. It's the same reason why when people talk about the SEC, you leave Starkville, Mississippi, maybe you won by 14 points. It doesn't mean you didn't get roughed up a good amount. They absolutely are going to make it a little bit tougher on you, not only that day, but the next couple of days. You're going to wake up very, very sore and be struggling just a little bit more. So we'll see what happens. But the reality is, it would be a crazy thing to watch if Texas and Oregon and Utah all walked into their conference and just kicked down the door. Just absolutely decided that they were going to run the conference the first year and win it outright. So that would obviously be a crazy thing to happen. I think if I had to pick one of those three that I'm least confident in, I think I'd pick Texas, just because I think there's a lot more hurdles that they have to get through. I think the physicality is a little bit of a problem from where I'm standing. I think they have the guys to handle it. That's not necessarily the issue I have. The more issue I have is there have been a tendency with Texas to kind of play with their food a little bit in some of these games over the past couple of years with Steve Sarkisian, and you can't do that in the SEC, just plain and simple. If you play with your food up in Lexington or down in Starkville or pretty much anywhere, you're going to get beat, to be totally honest with you. So that's the worry that I have for Texas. So if this were going to happen, you know, some things would have to go their way, obviously, and it would have to go the way of all of these teams if they were going to pull this off this upcoming year. But Utah, it's kind of business as usual, to be totally honest with you. It's just lifting a different trophy. They've won 3 of the last 4 conference titles they've been a part of, and they'll have 2 Pac-12. They'll also have 1 Big 12, and we'll get into a what-if here in a second. What if that's the only one they win? But that's a totally different conversation that we'll jump into. I think out of the 13 teams that are finding new landing spots, there are 9 that have a chance to compete over the next couple of years. I think there are 9 that absolutely will have something to say about these races over the next little bit. Now, I think Oklahoma, USC, Washington could take a little bit longer to come around. Maybe year 2, year 3 is when they're really ready to burst onto the scene. But Texas, Utah, Oregon, they seem fully ready to jump in and be a contender right away, and Vegas agrees with them. So obviously this would be a crazy thing, but it would definitely get things off and running for this new crop of teams rolling into their conferences and would start a very interesting conversation around pretty much all of these conferences. But let's move right along here, and the other one revolves around Texas and OU. What if Texas just outperforms, what if Oklahoma just outperforms Texas in the first year? This is something that I feel like has kind of been picking up some steam in the last couple of weeks with some of the college football people I've seen talking about, the quote unquote gap that exists between Oklahoma and Texas and how it's really not quite as there as some people might think. So obviously some things would have to go Oklahoma's way for this to happen. The O-line would have to come together. I think that is the biggest worry that I have for this team, and the biggest worry that really everyone has is the line of scrimmage play. And when you go into the SEC, that is the most important thing. So it makes sense that people are a little bit worried about Oklahoma going into this year. Texas is obviously just in a better place. They have the continuity at quarterback where Oklahoma doesn't. They have a little bit of that staff continuity, especially on the offensive side of the ball, that Oklahoma doesn't. They have a deeper roster, more an overall deeper roster, although the gap there isn't quite as big as some people might suggest. And overall, the confidence at O-line and D-line is just totally different. So there are gaps. There's no two ways about that between these two teams, but they're not necessarily massive. They're not necessarily things that Oklahoma can't overcome. And everything is moving in the right direction for Oklahoma. The intention and the energy in that program is different than it was with Lincoln Riley. Not to say it's entirely better. It's just a little bit different under Brent Venables. I would argue that it's better, but that's a totally different thing. I do think this is a team that is just going to build up steam, and I don't think they're ever going to walk into a venue not ready to give 110%. Can they outperform Texas? That's a tall order. But frankly, I think it's going to come down to that game in Dallas, and Oklahoma won it last year, so it's not necessarily the crazy thought to think if that's the flip coin game, Oklahoma has won it a lot more times than Texas has recently. So it's not crazy to think that this could happen. And also, you could easily make the argument if both of these teams are 9-3 at the end of the season, Oklahoma had the better season because Oklahoma plays the tougher schedule. They play some teams that Texas narrowly avoids and is definitely very happy to avoid. But at the end of the day, if both these teams have the same record, you can argue that it was more impressive for Oklahoma to get to that record than it was for Texas. But at the end of the day, Texas is in a better place going into this year. They are definitely the team that if I had to bet money, I would bet that they would have the better year than Oklahoma, but it's not to say that it can't happen. And there would be tons of people rejoicing in Norman. There would be tons of people rejoicing all across the SEC as Texas walks into this and gets humbled just a little bit by the team that has been humbling them quite a bit over the last little bit. So obviously this would be a crazy thing that would happen. These two teams have a ton riding on this year. Oklahoma a little bit less so than Texas, but still a huge year for Brent Venables and company, and Jackson Arnold absolutely huge to this. But at the end of the day, Oklahoma has the ability to do this, but it's going to be an uphill battle, that's for sure. So it'll be fascinating to watch that. But the final one I want to break down is, what if Utah comes into the Big 12, plants their flag in that conference, and then just up and leaves? What if they just decide that they really want to be in the ACC? This is something that we've heard some rumors about where Utah wanted to be in the Big 10, didn't get the invite to the Big 10, and then everything was kind of just taken up. They had to find a new home, and the Big 12 was the best place for that, but the ACC is likely where they want to be. Well, the Big Ten's where they want to be, but the ACC would be a nice consolation prize for where they want to be right now, and it would be an interesting thing to watch, especially with Florida State and Clemson possibly looking that direction. I think Utah is one of those things where they're walking into this conference with all the confidence in the world. They have everything in place to win that conference, to possibly go undefeated and roll through this conference this upcoming year and get to Arlington, get to the playoff. But then everything in the offseason gets a little bit hairy. You know, what if the ACC has lost a couple of teams and they're out shopping for some new teams, and maybe they try to pull Utah the other direction? And the interesting thing about this is, it's not necessarily that they would just be moving to the ACC. That is something that we've talked about a little bit and wouldn't be the craziest thing in the world with all of the conference realignment stuff that has happened. The question is what would happen from there, because I tend to think it would start somewhat of a conference realignment war. I don't want to put it that way, but there is this idea in me where, let's say Utah gets taken by the ACC. The ACC comes over and quote-unquote poaches Utah from the Big 12. Brett Yormark is not someone that I would want to mess with, especially in these realignment talks, and I think he's someone that might just hold that grudge, might just try to come back at the ACC and steal some of their teams later on in the process. So this would be a fascinating thing to watch happen. Not only Utah coming in and winning the conference, going to the playoff, being the top team in that conference this upcoming year, but then leaving and possibly starting a whole heap of mess around them. So it'll be fascinating to watch this. I think it'll be just crazy to see what happens in this. But at the end of the day, Utah has said pretty outright, or at least through reports, I don't want to say that anything too definitively, but it does feel like Utah wants in on the ACC, or they want in on the Big 12, but they'll take the ACC. And if that's the case, then maybe it's after this year. Maybe a lot of things happen very quickly, and somehow the Big 12 loses their conference champion 2 years in a row, with Texas leaving for the SEC and then Utah out the door for the ACC. So this would be fascinating to watch. Obviously, would have implications beyond the field, and would have massive conference realignment implications, but it'll be fascinating to watch that. There's no two ways about that. But that'll do it for this edition of the GSMC College Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Sports Network. Your support means a lot to us, so please remember to subscribe to the show, leave a positive review. It does make a huge difference for us. Also, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, TikTok, Instagram. We have just incredible people covering every single sport you could possibly want. So anything in the world of sports, we have you totally covered. We will be out the next 2 days, so don't expect a show the next 2 days, but we will be back on Monday, and it's time to roll on Monday. A lot of things are going to be happening over the next couple of weeks with media days, with recruitment, with conference realignment, and house settlement. We'll break down all of it, but we're going to get started on Monday, so enjoy your 4th of July weekend. Definitely have a good time. Be safe out there, but have a good time out there, and we'll definitely reconvene on Monday. So thank you once again for listening, and I will see you guys on Monday.